Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and May is over already. I do not know how it happened, but it did. And so we got to wrap up all the books that I read in the month of May, which I read a ton of books this past month. I read a lot of books. There were some in the spooky genre, there were some in the fantasy genre. I even read like a comedy book. I read some picture board books. Now, I read 23 total books in the month of May, which was 2,592 pages of books. And I'm not going to be talking about all of the books that I read because some of them were picture board books. And I don't want to have to go through those with you here because I don't have all of them. Because if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know that sometimes I stand in the bookstore and read the picture books to look and see what kind of books there are. I'm a children's pastor, so I often sit and I read different books to see if I like them, if they're going to be good for buying to put in our church nursery kind of area. So I read a lot of board books and picture books in the store, which is part of the 23, but not all of the 23. I have quite the stack of other books that I read, so let's dive right in. The first book that I read in the month of May was a book I actually was kind of finishing from April, so I don't know if it totally counts as 100% in May, but it is a book that I finished in the month of May, and that was The Excitorn Adventures, book number 5, Segra and the Magician by Peggy Downing. Now this series, I love this series so much. These ones, no one's ever heard of them in their life. You know, it's funny, my reviews of these books are some of my lowest videos on the channel, and that's okay, because if you search the internet for these books, there's like nothing out there about them. They are so not talked about, and so I wanted to be someone who put out the conversation, even if it's a small group of people that join in. I'm okay with that. This is a cozy fantasy series that is just so wonderful, kind of in the style and tradition of Chronicles of Narnia or the Archives of Anthropos or Chronicles of Prydain, kind of those, you know, those older kind of feel-good, cozy fantasy stories. Except the only thing here that I will say is Peggy Downing, she really went there with some things that were very interesting. She created some very strong female characters in Segra, who is one of the main characters in this whole series, who has a lot of agency. She's not just a damsel in distress. And what I love about this series in particular is sometimes there are books where one person is the hero and everyone else is not a hero and not helpful, and the main character is, you know, can do anything and everything and saves the day so easily. But in these books, it's such a team effort. And I love that. It is such a team effort between all the characters. There's never any one person who saves the day. It is the group of them coming together, learning to work together to save the day. And I absolutely love that so much. These books are really hard to find. Really hard to find. Some of them go for north of $300 on eBay to find just a copy. I have been super lucky to find copies of these at super cheap prices, so I've been snagging them up when I can. The only one I do not own is book number 2, which is almost impossible to find unless you want to pay like $170. And I don't want to pay $170, so it is what it is. But this was book number 5. It was so good, so much fun, such a great start to the month. The next book I read was book number 6 in the Excitorn Adventures, Brill and the Puffire Volcano. Now, I haven't actually reviewed this one yet, and I can't wait to talk about this book in a review because this book legit made me cry. I do not cry that often in books, but this book got me. It ended the series so perfectly in just the best place, and this was one of the most action-packed books in the entire series. It was so intense. Peggy Downing switched up the formula that she had been following for some of the previous books, making it something totally different, totally new, and it was just so good. I absolutely love this book. I cannot wait to talk about it. These books were all 5 stars for me because I just loved them so much. And then the next book I read, okay, this one was kind of a controversial one for me because in the sense, controversial, what kind, but in the sense of that, I didn't love all of this book, and that is Spooksville, book number 1, The Secret Path by Christopher Pike. Now, this book series, it came out in the 90s, and Christopher Pike is known for being quite a bit edgier than R.L. Stine in many places, and The Secret Path is a little edgier than any Goosebumps book that you might read, but it is a slow slog to get to the good stuff in this book, in my personal opinion. I do think that one of you described it really well. I think it was Spongy, described this super well and said that it's kind of like a pilot episode. And I thought, oh, yes, that completely frames this book in such a good way, because it really is kind of like a pilot episode to a series, because the books really continue and build upon each other. So this one, it was fine in the end, but it wasn't my favorite. The next book I read was actually a collection of 3 novellas that are all horror books, and that was Fright Time number 1, which has 3 different short stories in it, or really novellas. This one has Madman on Main Street, Scary Harry, and It's Almost Dark. And this collection was fine. It wasn't as good as the other Fright Time book I read, but this one was pretty solid. Like, I will say it's a solid first book in the series. It introduces the concept. I think the novellas are all pretty good. They're not bad. The middle one, It's Almost Dark, was actually the middle book, which they had the order mixed up on the front of this. I don't know why. But It's Almost Dark was not good. It was kind of just like Goblin Monday, which I was like, R.L. Stine, were you reading Fright Time when you wrote Goblin Monday? Because this was like the same story. Anyways, it was fine. That one was fine. But the rest were pretty good. But it wasn't outstanding like another Fright Time book we're going to talk about in a minute. The next book I read, I was really scared to read it because I had read book number 6 in this series, and it was not good. It was pretty bad. And so I kind of had lost some hope in the series for a while. And on a whim, I decided, well, I'm going to do my usual mood reading self, and I'll try it. Let's see how it goes. So I read book number 7 in the Heebie-Jeebie series, Along Came a Spider by Rod Randall. And gotta say, this one brought the series back for me. This was such a good entry in the series. Heebie-Jeebies is a Christian Goosebumps knockoff series it's really pretty well done. Like, overall, this one is much better, I think, than the Spine Chillers Mysteries series by Freddie Katz, which was the other Christian kind of Goosebumps knockoff. There actually are 2 other series that are kind of spooky Christian books too, but I'll talk about those in a second. And this one, though, was really pretty good. It had a good mystery, kind of confusing ending at one spot, but overall a good mystery, really well done plot, and great characters, and it brought the series back for me. So I was really excited about that. Plus, I will just throw it out here. So I managed to get in contact with Rod Randall, and he may or may not be coming on the channel sometime soon to do an interview about these books. So it's really exciting. Also, I don't know if any of you have seen, but when I bought these books back in like December of last year, November of last year, somewhere in there, these books were all pretty cheap to buy at that time. And since then, they have skyrocketed in price. There's been kind of a run on these books. So good luck finding some of them. I believe Piranha Picnic, book number 9, is going for like $80 right now online. So good luck trying to find them. I actually did find a copy of this one for like 50 cents at a bookstore. So it's possible to find them in the wild, but it could be a little tricky. So definitely keep your eye out for them. If you want to read this series or you want to just collect spooky middle grade books, keep your eye out. The next book I read was actually going to be my Mother's Day read, but then it didn't end up being a really Mother's Day-y book, but it was one of my favorites. This was top book of the month for me in a lot of ways because it was so good. And that is book number 9 in the Spine Tingler series by M.T. Coffin, Step on a Crack. This book was so good. I absolutely loved it. I said in my review, there was one part near the end that's a tiny bit confusing to follow, but the rest of it is just top notch. It has such an evil villain. It is so spooky and scary. Like, this one is one of those books that it's not like a bunch of jump scares. It is like a dread where you know something as the reader, and it is like one of those things where you're just dreading what could happen. And it was so good. I cannot recommend this book enough. If you have not read this one, drop whatever else you're reading and read this, because it was that good. And then the next book I read was actually an interesting discovery, because there was another Christian Goosebumps knockoff series that came out in the 90s, and that was Tales from the Bayou, and this is book number 1, Old Jake and the Pirate's Treasure by Betty Hager. Now this series, this one's pretty good. It was pretty spooky. I really liked it. It was set in like the Depression era, which I've never thought about that era for the setting of a spooky book, but it fits so well because there's this background of despair in the Depression time in the United States, and so it adds to the spookiness of the book because you're in spooky situations that are really scary and you're wondering what's going to happen, and you have that backdrop of despair that's like, what's happening in our entire nation, what's going to go on. So this was a great fun read. It is kind of old school. This is like a very old school story because this first book was actually written in the 1980s and like the early 80s. And then it was re-released in the 90s by Zondervan as their answer to Goosebumps. There are 4 books in the series, which this is the only one of the series I've read so far, but the last 3, the newer ones, they were actually written in the 90s. So I'm very curious to see how those ones play out versus this book, which definitely is a little episodic in a tiny way, but there is a lot of overarching spooky stuff with this treasure that's going on, and they're in the bayou, and the bayou setting is so well used. It's great. I had a good time reading this book for sure. And then I read one of probably like the worst books that I read this month, but you know, it was a Shivers book. It was Shivers number 6, The Haunting House. This book, I just couldn't really, the more that I've thought about this book and how ridiculous it is, the more I just am like shaking my head thinking, what on earth? The ending of this book, if you have read it, you know, is so ridiculous. It is just top-notch ridiculous. I kind of laughed through the end of the book thinking, what? That is how you're solving this issue and this problem is just so dumb. So it was fine, but it was not good. It definitely is not one to go hurry up and read. I think if you're reading Shivers books, unless you're a completionist who has to read them all, you could easily skip this one. The next book I read was also not that great. And unfortunately, it was a Goosebumps book. It was Goosebumps number 47, Legend of the Lost Legend. And I just did not really like this one that much. I was kind of interested because I thought, oh, it's like a grim fantasy kind of thing. That's a Goosebumps story, so that could be really cool. And I will say the setup is good. The very end is good. But the middle part is trash. Just trash. It is like so random and just like running around from one thing to the next and just kind of goofiness that doesn't make any sense at all. So, again, unless you're a Goosebumps completionist, you don't need to read this one. Don't need to read it. And then the next book that I read was Spooksville number 2, The Howling Ghost. Now, this was a buddy read I did with Zach from Shadyside Library, and unfortunately, Zach didn't really like this book, but I really loved it. So this one was great. It kind of had like a Freak of the Week sort of vibe. Like if you ever used to watch Smallville, and you know how Smallville sometimes would have these episodes where there was just like the Kryptonian monster of the week that had been affected by kryptonite, and then Clark is going to fight him, and then they're going to go on to the next thing like nothing ever happened. That's kind of like what this book is, except it does introduce a new pivotal character, which sounds like she is in it for the rest of the series. So that is awesome, and that character is great. And I really enjoyed this one. It actually got me a couple times. There were a couple of plot twists that I thought, oh, that got me. That's really good. I like it. So this was a fun one. I enjoyed Spooksville book number 2, and I can't wait to read number 3. And then I returned to the Heebie-Jeebies series to read book number 8, Dances with Werewolves, which, okay, so Paul Buchanan wrote this one. He also wrote like the worst one in the Heebie-Jeebies series, but he wrote this book, and in this book, there are 3 short stories that are horror stories told around the campfire, and they are so good. So good. They're almost worth just buying this book to read those because they're excellent, which explains a lot coming up in a minute. But I just kept thinking, wow, this is a really great scary entry. And then the end. And the end, I will just say, there is something else they could have done that would have been great, and I thought would have been so perfect that they didn't do, and instead went on this totally random jumping the shark sort of thing at the end that you're thinking, wait, what? Where did any of this even come from? And how does that even fit in with the rest of what's been happening? That doesn't make any sense. And so unfortunately, this one does not end very well, but the journey is so great. Those short stories are worth reading this book just for those alone, because those were actually super scary, like really creepy stories. So I really enjoyed this one. And then I went straight into the most expensive Heebie-Jeebies book on the internet right now, Piranha Picnic, book number 9 by Rod Randall. This is the last one Rod Randall wrote for the series, and this one was pretty good. It had a great twist. It had some good moments. It had some great misdirects and red herrings and things that are going on. So it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed reading this one, and I feel like this one was one of the stronger ones in the series for sure. And then I went right into book number 10 of Heebie-Jeebies, Return to Terror Cove by Paul Buchanan. Now, I do have to say, this particular book does have a few problematic elements in it, unfortunately, but the setting was so great, and the general idea was so good, and the twist ending was a great idea that was actually causing a lot of danger. So I really do like this one on the whole. There were just a few elements that I had to kind of grimace past and think, oh no, I wish you didn't do that, because that's kind of a weird thing to say and a weird thing to do. And there was one character in this book that comes in like about almost 2/3 in that was just so goofy and strange, and I just didn't love that character. It was just too over the top and kind of made it too silly when the rest of the book was pretty serious and pretty grounded actually. So that was unfortunate, but overall this was a good ending to the series of Heebie-Jeebies, and now I've read them all. So be watching for the ranking of all 10 books in the Heebie-Jeebies series coming soon. And then, I read one of my favorite books of the month. This was such a great collection. Fright Time number 3, which has Terror Town, Medal of Horror, and Kid Willie's Ghost. Which Kid Willie's Ghost is the winner here for me. That was also written by Paul Buchanan, who wrote in the Heebie-Jeebies series. And Kid Willie's Ghost is such a great novella. It was so well written. I so enjoyed it. It is poignant. It is scary. It has heart. It has just great tense moments of horror. And it was so well done. And I kept thinking, oh, this is so good. Paul Buchanan, why didn't you bring some of this to the Heebie-Jeebies series? I mean, he kind of did in Dances with Werewolves, definitely brought it in a little bit. And some of the storytelling elements you can see in the Heebie-Jeebies books. But overall, this, I think, is one of those situations where an editor is paired perfectly with a writer, and they work together very well to create something that is so well done. And I love this entire collection. This is one not to skip in the Fright Time series for sure. The next book I read was also a great read. I really enjoyed this one. It is Fear Street number 13, The Secret Bedroom by R.L. Stine. Now this is my first Fear Street book that had some supernatural elements in it, and it was a little surprising. And actually, interestingly enough, when I didn't think there could be supernatural elements in the storyline, I actually found it a lot scarier than when there were supernatural elements, and I thought, oh, okay, well, now I know what it is. It's not quite as scary to me. And so that was kind of interesting. Like, that was an interesting journey because I read this one when I was in a bed and breakfast on vacation, and it was like this super old house, and she's in this super old house in the book, and hearing the creaking of the wind and all this kind of stuff in the house. And so it was a great atmosphere to read this book, and I really enjoyed it a lot. It was a lot of fun. Definitely a great Fear Street entry. And then the second to last book I read in the month of May was kind of weird, but kind of funny, but so dated, so incredibly dated. And that was book number 1 in the incredible worlds of Wally McDougal, My Life as a Smashed Burrito with Extra Hot Sauce, which, yes, is the longest series name and title name ever. And this is a series by Bill Myers, who also wrote the Forbidden Doors series, which is another Christian kind of, it's a Fear Street knockoff, really, is what Forbidden Doors is, but it's a Christian, like, Fear Street knockoff series that he wrote. This one's for a little bit younger readers than Forbidden Doors, and this is like the comedy series of the 90s. Back in the 90s, they wrote comedy books more like the Goosebumps kind of style, in the sense of, like, the books were like 120 pages, there wasn't a lot of art in them, and nowadays I feel like the comedy genre for kids has really shifted to things like Dog Man and Dave Pilkey stuff, and, you know, the Agents of Suit, and those sorts of, like, almost half graphic novel, half story that's told in prose. And so the comedy genre's kind of changed a little bit, I think, nowadays. Versus in the 90s, this is like the comedy of the time. Some of the comedy is very 90s. Some of it is very outdated. Some of it is very odd towards girls in particular, and I did not like that at all. I thought it was very, very weird, some of the statements that were made. And so this book was kind of a problem in some ways, but also entertaining in other ways. And I feel like I actually read this as a kid. After I read it, I thought, this is really familiar. But then the other thing about this book is that the character's journey in this book is actually pretty good. So I had a lot of mixed feelings about this book. It's really weird and really out there, but it was entertaining. The last book I read in the month of May was Forbidden Doors number 4, The Haunting by Bill Myers. And okay, so I read the Forbidden Doors books a long time ago when I was a teenager, and so I was super curious how they held up, and, you know, to me now, so many years later. So I was really curious, like, what will these be like? Will I still like them? Will I not like them? What will I think about them? And I will say it's been kind of weirdly hit and miss. Like, the first book was actually pretty decent. Second book was pretty decent too, except for one unfortunate use of a very outdated term. And then book number 3 and 4 now both get to some very interesting theology that I personally don't believe. I think there are a lot of people who do believe theology like this. It's what's called Pentecostalism, where there's a lot of belief in your words and the things you say having power and being able to say things to affect especially demons or the spirit world, things like this. So it's kind of an interesting subset of Christianity. And I feel like what's interesting about this series is I wouldn't want someone to read these books and think that this is what all Christians think, because it's not. This book in particular definitely goes down some interesting rabbit holes and has a very glaring mistake. So I am a children's pastor, and I have a master's of divinity, and this book makes a giant mistake because it's talking throughout this book about how you can 100% trust the Bible, and there's nothing in the Bible that's incorrect. And one of the things they talk about is that there's no such thing as ghosts according to the Bible. So unfortunately, I hate to break it to you, but in 1 Samuel 28, there actually is a story with a ghost. Where, okay, here's the setting of this story. So in 1 Samuel 28, King Saul, he is in a battle against this people group called the Philistines. And he believes that he might be losing. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And so he decides to consult a medium. So he goes to the medium and he pays the medium to bring back Samuel, who is a prophet who spoke for God and could tell, here's what God says. Here's what's happening in Israel. So he brings this medium in, consults with her, and then she calls up Samuel. And I will say, a lot of Bible scholars are actually pretty torn on exactly what's going on. And I believe that a Pentecostal theologian would look at that story and say that it's not a ghost of Samuel, it's actually a demon being brought back. But there are actually some big problems with that, because what Samuel says really fits with who Samuel is and was as a person when he was alive. And he doesn't give Saul a false message or a lie or anything like that. He actually tells him, what God says. Here's what God says. So there's a lot of different thoughts about what's going on there, but it does appear that there is this ghost of Samuel that gets called up from his resting place called Sheol, which is a whole long theological conversation. All that to say, in this book, they're like, there's no such thing as ghosts of the Bible. Well, there is. So you gotta revise what's going on here. So there's a lot more that I could say about this particular book, but I will say, the thing about these books, even though I don't love some of the theology of them now as an adult, I do think that the storylines are so engaging and they just pull you in. And when there is spooky stuff happening, it is scary. And there's some great moments in the end of this one where they're having this moment with a seance that is super scary, and there's some spooky stuff happening that I really enjoyed this book a lot. So read these at your own risk, I guess you could say. If you can get past some of the theology things that are going on, mainly too, because I will just say there's a lot of painting people as villains in the sense of, in this book, there's a lot of Christians versus non-Christians. And a lot of oh, those people are Christians, those people are not Christians. And people who in this book are not a Christian are kind of vilified sometimes or painted as really stupid. So I don't like that at all. I really hate that, that whole idea and that way of talking about people. So it's a mixed bag, needless to say. This is why I haven't reviewed books 3 and 4 yet, even though I've reread both of them. I have been trying to think about my thoughts about them and piece it all together, and it's kind of difficult because I just did, you kind of have to have some weird theological conversations around these that are kind of complicated in some senses, and so that is everything. Well, not everything, but almost everything I read, minus the board books that I read in the month of May. It was a really fun month of reading books. I really enjoyed a lot of the books that I read. They were just, like I said, a ton of fun. It was a great month of reading books. I really loved some of the books I read. Quite a few 5 stars, actually. I'm surprised. I actually have already read a 5-star book for June, which I'm so excited to talk about. I loved it so much. But that's for June, not for May. One last thing I want to say is that the channel has hit 200 subscribers. So I am going to be doing a 200 subscribers Q&A video very soon. I have quite a few questions from a lot of you already, but if you haven't submitted a question yet, go watch my 200 subscribers Q&A video and leave a comment there with a question that you have for me. It could be anything from what kind of video games do you like to play to what's your rarest book you own, all kinds of fun things. I'll even tell you about my favorite animal if you want to know that. So let me know in the comments down below. If you can also put the questions here, I'll get them here too. But I would love to have your questions so I can put together that video. I'm super excited to have hit 200 subscribers. It's so exciting and fun, and I just am having a blast being here on YouTube talking about books. Who knew it would ever be a thing, but here it is. So, until next month, everybody, keep reading. Bye!